Good evening. It's good to be with you once again. We are going to be in Psalm 88. Psalm 88 is the text that we're going to look at tonight. And this lesson's theme is about suffering and a resilient faith in that suffering. And it's not just suffering, but overwhelming suffering, where each day feels like a life and death situation, like you are hanging on by a thread. Psalm 88. This psalm is filled with darkness and death. Apparently, it has the heaviest concentration of references to death in the Old Testament. In other words, the most places that death can be found mentioned or alluded to in one spot. It's a prayer. Psalm 88 is a prayer, and it's a prayer that God listen to our prayer, and that God deliver us from whatever it is that is hurting us. Let's go ahead and read the text just to get it before us. And then we will comment on it and give some lessons from it. Psalm 88. The title part says, a psalm of the sons of Korah for the choir director, according to Mahalath Lanoth. A maskil of Heman the Israelite. Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out before you day and night. May my prayer reach your presence. Listen to my cry. For I have had enough troubles, and my life is near Sheol. I am counted among those going down to the pit. I am like a man without strength, abandoned among the dead. I am like the slain lying in the grave, whom you no longer remember, and who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest part of the pit, in the darkest places, in the depths. Your wrath weighs heavily on me. You have overwhelmed me with all your waves. You have distanced my friends from me. You have made me repulsive to them. I am shut in and cannot go out. My eyes are worn out from crying. Lord, I cry out to you all day long. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do departed spirits rise up to praise you? Will your faithful love be declared in the grave, your faithfulness in Abaddon? Will your wonders be known in the darkness, or your righteousness in the land of oblivion? But I call to you for help, Lord. In the morning my prayer meets you. Lord, why do you reject me? Why do you hide your face from me? From my youth I've been suffering and near death. I suffer your horrors. I am desperate. Your wrath sweeps over me. Your terrors destroy me. They surround me like water all day long. They close in on me from every side. You have distanced loved one and neighbor from me. Darkness is my only friend. I hope that you can see from reading through the psalm, there's no moment in the psalm where the tone changes. where it goes from hopelessness to hopefulness. Why? Why did the Psalms include this psalm? Some may think, as we read this is dark and heavy. Where's the light at the end of the tunnel? But I hope after this lesson you'll see maybe we need a psalm like this for various lessons that we can draw from it that I'm going to point out. So here's a couple things that we see just offhand, observations about this psalm. The psalmist, it says that it was by Heman the Ezrahite. He's mentioned in Chronicles. He was apparently a member of the sons of Korah, or I guess you could say this guild of singers who David started. And so he was a professional temple worshiper, so to speak. And so he was an expert at lyric and songs and psalms and hymns and all that. Well, this psalm is extremely dark, but what is it? How does Heman, the Ezrahite, how does he view God in the psalm? He calls God at the first verse, Lord, God of my salvation. God of my salvation. That's about as hopeful or positive as the entire psalm gets. That's its one piece of light, so to speak. When he calls God, God of my salvation. But then we see how he describes God later on, that he clearly thinks that God is behind his suffering. And so, here's some examples. In verse 6, or rather verse 5, start in verse 5, where he's saying that he is counted as a dead man. It says in verse 5, he's abandoned among the dead. He says, I'm like the slain, lying in the grave, whom you no longer remember. So there his view of God is that once you die, God seems to not really care about you anymore. That's at least his perspective. Then in verses 6 through 8, he sees God as the one who is putting him through this suffering. You have put me in the lowest part of the pit. In other words, it's not just the pit that I feel like I'm at. In verse 4, he mentions going down to the pit. He's counted among those going down to the pit. In other words, people around him consider him like a dead person because he's so troubled. Whatever his troubles are, he doesn't get specific into them. But we see how he's feeling. You have put me in the lowest part of the pit. So now he's like, not only am I counted as those who go to the pit, which was a reference to death, I have a booking at the lowest part of the pit. In the darkest places, in the depths, your wrath weighs heavily on me. Your wrath. So he views God as angry with him for some reason. Maybe it's because of sin that he has done. Maybe it's not. But whatever it is, his perspective is, I feel like God is angry with me. Your wrath weighs heavily on me. You have overwhelmed me with all your waves. You have distanced my friends from me. You have made me repulsive to them. So not only does he feel like God is putting all these stresses in his life, but also he feels like God is the reason that he is losing all dignity and honor within the community around him. He feels complete shame, especially in a culture that would have highly valued honor, glory, and a good name. Look at verse 14. He asked God directly, verse 14, Lord, why do you reject me? Why do you hide your face from me? So he is pouring out his prayers to God, and he's doing it regularly. He's doing it several times. The text stresses that it's every day, it's every morning, it's all day long. And he feels rejected. He feels that God's not listening. Why do you reject me? Why do you hide your face from me? In verse 18, the psalmist ends in a very peculiar way. He says that, again, you have distanced loved one and neighbor from me. Darkness is my only friend. Why does he feel like he has no friends who can help him in this time of crisis? Why does he feel like everyone around him is shunning him when he needs them the most? Well, he thinks that God is partly responsible for that. What does that tell us about our prayers and how we talk to God? Well, in one way, he's talking to God like he really believes God exists. Even if he's angry at God, even if he's frustrated at God not doing something right now to get him out of this trouble or this suffering or this pain, he is still constantly referring to God as someone who is there and who is aware of his situation. He doesn't doubt God's existence at all. He doesn't doubt God's existence. He doesn't doubt that God is even necessarily ignorant of his situation. And under those questions, why do you reject me? Does it not imply that there's kind of a belief in the goodness of God? Why are you rejecting me? This seems out of characteristic with the God I believe in. And so as we can see these strong statements about God and him talking to God, what is he doing? He's getting raw with God. He's what some people might say, he's getting real with God. He's telling God how he feels. Whether it's true or not. He's laying it out on the table. He's spilling his guts. Now, you might be the type of person who never has problems with being angry at God, and that's great. But there are some who do have problems or temptations or tendencies to be at least irritated or frustrated at God for not fixing all the problems that we think need to be fixed right now. Maybe we think, oh, if God could just make my life just a little bit easier. I'm not asking you to get rid of all pain. I'm just asking you for a little bit easier life. Maybe you could be more productive. Maybe you could read the Bible more. Maybe you could evangelize more. Maybe you have all these things that you could do. You could attend church more. If God just helped you a little bit with this pain you're experiencing, or this daily pressure or stress or whatever it is, why does God not help us in that way always? He has no friends. Verse 8 and verse 18 both re-emphasize that. He can't find a friend for help in all of this, and there is no relief in sight of his suffering. And it looks like he's just getting pounded by one wave after another after another. And as soon as the wave comes over him and he's getting pinned down to the beach, and he's ready to get up and get a breath, another wave hits him again. And he can barely keep his head above water enough to get some oxygen. And so while he views God as behind his suffering in some way, one thing he does not do, he does not quit praying. He does not quit praying. In verse 1, he says, I cry out before you day and night. In other words, that's a way to say constantly throughout every day. Day and night. Then he says in verse 9, my eyes are worn out from crying. Lord, I cry out to you all day long. In verse 13, he mentions that he is praying to God every single morning. He says, but I call to you for help, Lord. In the morning, my prayer meets you. And so he is diligent in his prayer life. He is praying constantly. He is not giving up praying to God. And this is where we see something about his faith. Even though he feels that he is unprecedentedly suffering, and that he thinks God is responsible for his suffering in some way, and he's angry at God, even though those are true, at least in his mind, he has a faith that utterly will not let go. I take a liking to Psalm 88. Because sometimes I think this is how we feel. We're going through problems in our life. And you know the saying, when it rains, it pours. It's never just one thing. You have a car wreck, and then you think, okay, well, I'm okay. Then the next day or the next week, a family member dies. then you lose your job. And sometimes it just keeps piling on and piling on and piling on. And you just think, God, can't you give me a break? And we can read the passages in the Bible that talk about how suffering is good for us in the sense of, rejoice when you go through various trials, knowing that the trials produce hope and they produce endurance in you, and they're building your character, and they're teaching you lessons that you could never learn through ease and comfort. We understand that, and we can pay mouth service to that. But totally accepting it as a truth is another thing altogether. And so why do we have Psalm 88? It seems like a tragedy if you were talking in terms of theater. It ends with no hope. It ends, so to speak, with the death of the main character. Darkness is my only friend. I'm going to suggest that there's 4 things that we can learn from this psalm. 4 things. And then we'll close our lesson. Number 1, I think this psalm shows us the realities of life, and that it shows us that not all of life's stories have a happy ending right here, right now. Why is that important for us to understand and to accept? I think partly is because we kind of expect to have a good life with relatively minor struggles through the years. You get a job, you get a career, you make a family. Everybody's a loving family. The job is good. You make money, you build wealth, and then you retire and you get to enjoy life a little bit more. And then when you are dying, you're in your 90s, and you fall asleep peacefully and go on. I think that's kind of my fantasy of how to die and how to live. But I bet if I were to interview every single person in here, has your life played out that way so far? The vast majority of you would say no. Not all of life's stories here have happy endings. In the Psalms, the most common psalm is a psalm of lament. Lament is where they are praying to God and they're explaining to God their problems and what they think God should do and all of that, and their cry for help. In other words, there's a problem and they need help. They're desperate. That's the most common psalm in the book of Psalms. Why do you think that is? Could it be showing us a reflection of the difficulties of life generally and what to expect? Maybe that's one reason why reading the Psalms is so important, because it trains us to be able to meet reality when it hits us. I don't think anybody is really ready for reality when it hits you. But the Psalms at least can teach us some pathways to go about and ways of thinking when we do get hit. The thing about the other Psalms of Lament that's different about this one is in all the other Psalms of Lament, they usually start with the problem and describing what they want God to do, and then they talk about how God is good and how God is their salvation and how God has done so much for them. Sometimes it switches and it seems like that God, in the midst of their prayer, has already answered their psalm, and they start thanking God for answering the prayer and thanking God for His goodness and His everlasting covenant and all of that. In other words, most Psalms of Lament, they might start dark, but they end with a light note. This psalm has no light note that it ends with. Darkness is my only friend. And most of the time, I think, in the Psalms of Lament, when facing a problem, it's temporary. We know we're going to get through it. We know we're going to get over it. That's how a lot of times troubles in our life are. But then there's some problems that won't go away. You lose a family member who you know was not faithful. How do you deal with that the rest of your life? You have chronic pain that the doctor says you're going to have to deal with the rest of your life. There's no cures. There's no surgeries that can fix this. How do you deal with that? Not all life stories have happy endings. And the more we accept that, the less we will be victim of getting angry and bitter at God when things don't go the way we wish they'd go, and lose our faith entirely. Number two, a second lesson I think we can gain from this psalm is that this psalm, in a lot of ways, answers the question that Satan asked about God in Job 1 and 2. You remember the story, Job 1 and 2. It begins by showing that Job was a very wealthy man, very righteous man. He had everything going for him. He had a large family. He had lots of land, lots of cattle. And it says he was the greatest man in the East. And so this guy is, a top elite of the elites in his society. And Satan sees that, and he goes to God and asks God if he can get into Job's life and try to wreck it. And Satan tries to say, the only reason Job is so faithful to you is because you give him all this stuff. You take away the stuff, and then he'll curse you to your face. One thing that's interesting about that story is, why does Satan care? Why does Satan care if someone is following God because they have stuff or not? But he's making it his business. Because that's what jealousy does, or that's what envy, that's what bitterness does. He just wants to see good people fall. That's how he finds enjoyment. And so God says, okay, you can attack Job, just don't attack himself, his body. Leave him alive, leave him in health and all of that, and do whatever you want otherwise. So then we see that immediately all his kids die in a catastrophe. Same day. He gets all his possessions stolen from bandits. And a lot of his animals get slaughtered that he had poured money into in his investments. He loses everything overnight, except his wife. And he still says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So Satan was proved wrong. But then Satan goes back to God, and God asks him, well, what do you think about Job? He hasn't cursed me or anything like that. And he's gone through all this. And Satan says, well, okay. What Job really cares about is himself. He doesn't really care about all that stuff and his family and everything. What he really cares about is himself. You strike him, and then he'll give up on you. And so God says, okay, you can do with him what you wish. Just don't kill him. And Satan goes out, strikes him with boils from his head to his feet. And his wife is saying, why are you putting up with this? Just curse God and die. And Job says, you sound like one of the foolish women. Speak. Shall we accept good things from God, but not bad things? Here in Psalm 88, this man is showing that there are people out there who, no matter what they are going through, they will not give up on God. I think Job is a man who shows that. But I think you can probably know of people in your own life that you have met and whose influence has touched you. That you can know that person is a person who will be faithful to God no matter what comes his way. He's just determined, he's resolute, he knows what he wants, and he knows he's going to be faithful. And when we see examples like that, they help us. Because they show us it's possible. People do it. And so that leads us to ask the questions, are we just fair weather fans of God? Do we like God when he's good to us, but we don't really like him so much when we're not getting the things from him that we think we deserve or that we should get? Do you attend church, read your Bible, pray? Do you do that when things are good or when things are bad? Or do you do it when they're both? Some people seem to only do it when things are bad. There's other types of people who seem to do it only when things are good. Are you the type of people that bring it together and you do it no matter what's going on in your life, for good or bad? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be his name. Number 3, a third lesson that I think we can get from this psalm. This psalm is talking about all the suffering in this life. He doesn't bring up eternity. He's talking about this life and going through this life having these chronic problems and these chronic sufferings. And I think it can show us and remind us that even if our problems are lifelong events, they are still temporary. Look at Romans, or not Romans, 2 Thessalonians 5. A statement by Paul. I think it's one of the most powerful statements when you sit down and read this slowly. 2 Corinthians 4, not 5. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 through 18. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 through 18, he says, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day." And notice what he says in verse 17. "For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." How does he describe our suffering in verse 17? Everyone's suffering. Light and momentary. Light and momentary. There is a sense, no matter what we go through, it is light. And it is only momentary. But the only way we can believe that is if we keep our eyes on eternity. You know the last verse of Amazing Grace? I'm not going to say it exactly, but the idea of it is saying, when we've been there for 10,000 years, and it says, we know less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. What is that saying? It's saying, okay, you're in heaven for 10,000 years. Guess what? It's as if you have just started. It is as if you have just started living there. You've got another 10,000 years ahead of you. And when that 10,000 years is ahead of you was done, you got another 10,000 years. I mean, can you imagine that? Can you imagine that where time is nothing anymore? Death is nothing. You don't have to worry if your loved ones are going to die anymore. You don't have to worry about sickness anymore. You don't have to worry about all the things we worry about just to survive. Imagine in heaven never having to think, oh, I'm late. I better hurry up. Do you ever look at yourself and you go through some very painful experience? And I'm talking about bodily pain, physical pain. You go through it, and at the time it feels like I just want to die. It is so bad. I wish someone would get a gun and shoot me right now. There was a time when I had my wisdom teeth out back in, I think it was 2010, summer 2010. I had my wisdom teeth out, and a couple days later, I guess they got infected, or I had dry socket, or whatever it was. It felt like there was this sub-zero temperature wind going up into my brain, like a brain freeze constantly. If you've ever been to Sonic and you've had those what are they called? The slushies, or whatever they call them. Slurpees? Not Slurpees, slushies? I can't remember. But you know what I'm talking about. Those things give me brain freezes almost every time I drink them. But I was having that during this procedure, after this procedure, constantly. I was having to take opioids to deal with the pain. And I had to take opioids for a month and a half, because that's how long the pain lasted. Thankfully, I didn't get addicted to them. I didn't even know addiction to those things were a thing back then. But I remember thinking, if I have to live like this the rest of my life, I'm going to lose it. Because there's some pain that just hits you that way. It's so overwhelming and crippling. Migraines. There's probably people here who suffer with migraines. And if you have a bad one, it can totally lay you out, and you wish someone would get a sledgehammer and just crush your head. But when the migraine leaves, what are you thinking about that pain once it's gone? Do you think about it much? Sometimes when we're talking about experiences with pain like this, I can ask the question, and maybe sometimes you have a hard time even thinking, what did that feel like? No matter how hard it was, no matter how excruciating the pain was, what if we go through life now and we experience all these problems and we experience all this pain, and it seems unbearable in the moment, but the moment that we are in God's presence and we leave this life, it's almost, what if all that pain that we experience, it's like, what pain? What are you talking about? Oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah, I remember that now. Can you imagine that? And then maybe we'll look back at ourselves and think, I was doing some stupid stuff trying to deal with that pain. Silly. I was so silly and foolish. If only I'd known what would happen. Even if our problems are lifelong events, they are still temporary. And there will be an answer to the suffering of the writer of Psalm 88. Eventually. And then number 4, the psalm ultimately articulates the experience of Jesus, God Himself. You see, when we read about suffering in the Bible, especially the Psalms, we get an inside look at what they're going through. That's kind of what Psalm 22 does. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then he goes in and it just pours his heart out on how he's feeling and what he feels like God is doing or not doing, and what his situation is. And he feels like, all my bones are broken, or all my bones are like water, or however he says it. He's completely overwhelmed. That's kind of a look into what Jesus experienced when he was in front of the mob and they were saying, "Crucify him. Crucify him. We have no king but Caesar." Then they nail him to a cross and they say, "Huh, are you going to save yourself now? You saved all these other people, healed them while you were down. Are you going to do it to yourself now?" Look at him. A pretender. "Oh, you're thirsty? Oh, okay. Here's some wine. Here's some vinegar on a sponge that, we use to take care of our toiletries for. Here, have some." In Mark 14, 33 through 34, I'm going to look at this text and then we'll be done. Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, verses 33 and 34. This is Mark's account of the betrayal and crucifixion. In verse 33, he says, "And he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch.'" He went off, and then he came back, and what were they doing? They were asleep. In his most stressful time, he felt like his most closest friends didn't care. Look at verses 50 through 52. Verses 50 through 52. So the soldiers or officers come to arrest Jesus. And in verse 50, it says, "They all left him and fled." They all left him and fled. "And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked." In other words, whoever that guy was, he would rather be found naked in public than to be found hand in hand with Jesus at that moment. Jesus was engulfed in troubles. He had no friends. And in a sense, darkness was his only friend. And he tasted death for everyone. You see, that's what's so remarkable about Christianity as a religion, is that Christianity is the only religion where the God, or a God, the Creator, the ultimate powerful God, becomes a human and dies for bad people. And see, the cross has basically stamped into our heads, this is who I am. God showing us who He is. This is the type of God I am. I will stop at nothing to save you. And He jumps into the darkness Himself and goes all the way to as deep as the darkness goes Himself. He doesn't send someone else to do it. He doesn't make an angel do it. He doesn't tell us, well, here's some rules that can kind of help you get out, and good luck. He jumps in, experiences death fully and suffering fully for us. The creator of the universe, the maker of you and me, the one who holds the cosmos in His hand, saying, I love you this much. The darkness of Psalm 88 will be eclipsed by the light of the resurrection. Because we know what happens on the other side of Jesus' death. He's raised. That death is reversed. And He becomes a new creature. And He is showing us all the way how to imitate that death and resurrection in our own lives. To follow Jesus, to embrace the pain, to count it all joy when we go through various trials. Because He did it. And He's not asking us to do anything that He Himself is not willing to do. If there's anything we can do for you tonight in helping you in your walk with God, maybe you need to be baptized, you can do that tonight. Or maybe you just need prayers and encouragement from us. We are willing to help you in any way we can as we stand and as we sing.